Hi everybody, my name's Sarah and welcome to the Bottom Drawer series from the Bagri Foundation. This is a series that asks writers to ponder their inspirations for their work and their writing life from kind of the earliest things that they wrote up to their current work. And some of those early works might still be in the bottom drawer, which is where this series gets its name from. I'll be talking today about all of those things and more with Deepa Anappara, whose debut novel Gym Patrol on the Purple Line was released earlier this year. Deepa was born in Kerala in southern India and worked as a journalist in the country for 11 years. Her reports on the impact of poverty and religious violence on the education of children won the Developing Asia Journalism Awards, the Every Human Has Rights Media Awards, and the Sanskriti-Prabha Dutt Fellowship in Journalism. A partial of her debut, Gym Patrol on the Purple Line, won the Lucy Cavendish Fiction Prize, the Deborah Rogers Foundation Writers Award, and the Bridport Peggy Chapman Andrews Awards for a first novel. And as if that wasn't a huge achievement before it was signed, it's been published in a number of languages, double digits we're talking. So welcome, Deepa. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks to everybody who's watching, and thanks, Sarah, for doing this interview.
That's all right. I definitely want to talk to your early writing, but let's start right at the end of the journey for the moment. Tell us a little bit about Gym Patrol on the Purple Line and the story that is told in the book.
So, Gym Patrol on the Purple Line essentially came from my experiences as a journalist in India. I was born there and I worked as a reporter for over 11 years. And I wrote a lot of stories about poverty and its impact on children. I was very familiar with lives in these impoverished neighborhoods, and that's how I came to learn about the disappearances of children in such neighborhoods. And people didn't really pay much attention to those stories because the kids were from poor families, and but I was interested in those stories, and it was my work as a reporter, and I used to interview them about education, about schooling, and so when I heard these stories about neighborhoods where kids would disappear, as many as 20 or 30 of them, and they had never been found, and the police wasn't taking any action. I wanted to write something about what that experience is like for the children themselves, because that was a voice that was missing in the mainstream discourse. And my idea was to sort of talk to these children over time and find out how they, on a day-to-day basis, how did they deal with living in a neighborhood where sort of disappearances and kidnappings were frequent, and how did they make sense of it as children? But life has its own way, and I ended up not being a reporter and moving away from India to the UK and came here. But so those sort of stories and the children I had interviewed, that kind of stayed with me. And I tried to sort of approach it through fiction. When I first did a creative writing course here in this country in London. And I didn't succeed at all. I didn't know enough about writing fiction in the first place. So sort of put it aside and came back to it much later. And so essentially, this is Gym Patrol on the Purple Line is a story about the disappearances of children in an impoverished neighborhood on the outskirts of an Indian city. And it's about 3 children who are looking for their missing friends. It's told mostly from the point of view of a 9-year-old boy named Jay, who watches a lot of cop shows on TV and thinks he's a detective. So when children start disappearing, he decides to look for them with the help of his friends, Pari and Faiz. So it's a story about these kids who are looking for, their friends who are going missing, but it's also a story about how this impoverished community deals with these disappearances and essentially what happens when a society as a whole ignores what's going on in certain pockets, especially because these are people who are considered not to have any rights, and when sort of politicians and police don't pay attention to what's happening. But the story is told through the eyes of children, so they sort of bring their humor, they believe in the supernatural, like the jinns, into the story.
I mean, I'm fascinated about lots of aspects on it, which I'd love to talk about, but it's really interesting that this story is clearly something that has been living with you for a while. Can you talk a little bit about, if we sort of rewind now to your journalism career, was journalism something you always wanted to get into, or was it writing that you were sort of chasing and you found yourself in journalism? How did that come about?
So I think it was a combination of both. I used to read a lot, obviously, as a kid, and I wanted to write as well. At the same time, I had this. My mother used to say, "Oh, she's an incredibly sensitive child," because I would be bursting into tears at
Yeah.
anything that anybody said. So it was like a joke in the family, but it also meant that I had this sense of a very idealistic point of view as a child, and I had the sense of justice. But at the same time, if someone else would engage with that by speaking, by being an activist and going out and talking about it and sort of organizing protests and all that. And because of my nature, because I was such an introvert, that wasn't really how I could um, engage with what is happening to me. And sort of, I think when I was a child, I sort of realized that if I could be a journalist, a print journalist, I'd be able to write and at the same time sort of, speak to the issues of this very unequal society that I was living in. So I think it was both those facts that I wanted to write. And I thought that by being a journalist, I would also sort of make a livelihood because that was really important. And from the time I was a kid, we were told that, you can't go into arts. I think it'd be very, for many Asians, they would be very familiar with that kind of language. I mean, I was watching a movie recently and it had sort of the father telling the son, we don't write, we're Asians. It's something that, white people do. And so it's essentially, there was a version of that happening in my family as well. And so I thought if I could become a journalist and, I would have a livelihood and I would sort of try to write fiction afterwards. So yeah, that's how it started out. I was, like many people, I wrote bad poetry. I wrote sort of terrible short stories, and there were several unfinished novels when I was a teenager. But then, I did a course in journalism. I became a journalist, and that was sort of like a really full-time job. As a reporter in a city like Bombay or Delhi, you're sort of working 24 hours, and there's quite a lot of travel involved, and you're interviewing a number of people. So I really didn't have time for anything else.
That's interesting. So how long do you think that you sort of put fiction down for, as it were? So I'm intrigued that you wrote all of this stuff when you were a teenager, and I think all of us have some bad poetry somewhere, but not many of us will have even partial novels from that age. And then I find it interesting that you sort of put it down. Did you ever forget about it, or was this always there always this desire to go from telling stories as a journalist to then telling stories as a fiction writer?
It's very hard for me to think if there was an impulse to tell a story in one particular genre over another. I think what happened was that when I was working as a journalist, I was quite content being a journalist. There was a novel that I would write sort of once in 6 months. It was not like writing a novel at all, but there was a novel, there were some characters that I kept returning to, but I wasn't serious about it at all. And I wrote some short stories, but again, I wasn't, I was not doing it seriously. It was not for publication. It was the equivalent of sort of writing a journal. And I was very focused on, doing my reporting well, and all the other sort of, I used to edit and proofread. So I was doing all that, and I was very focused on all that. And I think the switch to fiction, it came with moving to the UK, and it had always been in the back of my head that I should do a sort of creative writing course, because I hadn't studied English literature. I didn't know anything about creative writing, and so I knew that there were these huge gaps in my knowledge as far as formal elements of writing is, as far as that's concerned. So it was, and when I moved here, I did one of these evening courses, and that's sort of where it started. And also, I think it also had to do with the fact that I was not a full-time journalist anymore. And I had all these stories in my head from, all my experience as a journalist, which you can't really put everything you see in a news report. And there are several constraints, including what's considered newsworthy, and what's you have to fit the specifications of the publication you're working for. And often you're really focused on what's a political aspect of a particular story, and you sort of have to pull back on the human elements because there are certain word counts. And so there are all these things that I'd not written about, which is there in my head. And I felt that I could explore that through fiction.
It's really interesting. Did you ever, those things that you say you weren't able to write about because of various constraints in whatever journalism job you were doing at the time, did you ever sort of write down like snippets of sentences or ideas, or was it really all kind of just in your head for years, kind of waiting until you were able to do something like the creative writing course and really start thinking about yourself as a fiction writer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've ever gone back to my notes. And in fact, I had like sort of, when I left India, I had to deal with sort of stacks of reporters' notebooks, which is, I don't know how many there are typically. And so I sort of just left all of that behind. I think I gave them away or whatever. But I had photographs, for instance, which I did go back and look at when I was working on fiction. But not really. I didn't have any sort of notes, and it was just essentially, what was in my head, like in terms of my memories. So that's what I relied on. Sometimes I went back and looked at some of the news reports that I had done at that time.
Yeah.
But that was very rare. It was mostly just memory.
So with the creative writing course, I mean, you said that you felt that you were lacking some sort of formal knowledge. I wonder, sort of a twofold question, really. What do you think journalism writing, and you mentioned you did some editing and proofreading, what sort of skills do you think that taught you that are essential to you now as a fiction writer? And then what sort of formal gaps were you looking to fill with the creative writing course?
I think, many people who've been journalists who write fiction, they say they learn discipline from it, because as a journalist, you have to sort of type as fast as you can, and you can't really say, I'm waiting for, my muse to turn up, and you have a deadline in the evening, you have to turn in that story. But so definitely, I think there is some of that discipline in how I can work, and I can work pretty much, I think, with all sorts of like noisy places. I can do that. I can work anywhere, and I think that comes from having worked as a reporter in India, which you don't have a quiet moment at all. But I actually had to sort of teach myself not to be a journalist, because I was so reliant on that sort of fact-based reporting that I've been trained in. And for me to just trust my imagination, it took a really long time. And I think one of the things that I had to teach myself was to essentially write something that wasn't true. Like it was just, as much as a road, I wouldn't want to put it somewhere if it wasn't real. And that really took me a long time to learn, to give myself permission to do that. It's just like part of the reason, I've set it Jin Patrol is set in an imaginary city. It's an unnamed city. And that was again a way to give myself permission to sort of create this world that I wanted to. Because I think as soon as I name something, then, I'm very much, as a journalist, I was very focused on research, and that's still there. And I think with fiction, you do have to find that balance of, allowing your imagination to sort of take you to places which might not really exist in reality. So yes, that was, I had to learn that. But again, I also didn't know anything about sort of just basic stuff like dialogue or story arcs. I don't think you have to follow any of those rules, but you do have to have some understanding of, how, what goes into a novel. And I didn't know any of those elements like structure, like plot and voice. So what a creative writing course taught me was, all these really basic stuff, which I think, you're taught that at GCSE or something here, which I didn't know. And it taught me to read closely. And I think earlier when I was, I used to read a lot, just essentially reading for the language or for the story. And what a creative writing course taught me was to sort of dismantle what's on the page and see how a writer has created a scene, or created a character, what's the approach towards dialogue, what is unsaid on the page, and how has a writer created a particular effect. So those were the sort of things that I learned to do by studying writing. It's, obviously I'm not going to say that everyone needs to do a course to understand all this. And I think an English literature degree would have probably taught me to do some of that, but I didn't have that sort of, my background was in sort of economics and journalism. And so I had to really teach myself how to do that, and the courses helped.
I'm intrigued what you said about sort of teaching yourself to trust your imagination. I mean, how did you do that? Was it just a case of you sort of wrote and wrote and wrote until you got used to it in a way? Or was there an exercise that you used to do? Or how did that work?
I think it was partly seeing my peers at these workshops, writing workshops. In particular, I remember once we had to write, we did a class on historical fiction, and we had to write something which could be considered historical, a short story or an extract from a novel for the class. And one of my friends submitted something, and later I was asking him, okay, so how did you know that this is what they did at that time? Because it's something very specific. And he said, I didn't know, I just put it in because I thought it was interesting. And for me, that was just like, right, it doesn't have to be real, because I thought it added so much to the story. I'm not going into the specifics because I want to respect his privacy and the story as well. But it was just that idea that you could, just watching others do it, write things, even if it was based on stuff that had happened in their lives, by adding something from the imagination, it brought in so much else, and the story really came alive. And I think it was just I learned from watching them and seeing how what they brought to their writing, which wasn't real. And it was, obviously I knew that all writers did that, but sort of seeing that actually happen, and, because you become friends with people eventually, and you sort of know what's going on in their lives. And then you're able to, so if they've told you something has really happened, and then you see how they've written it in fiction, you can actually visualize the difference. So I think that had something to do with me being able to trust my imagination more.
I love that you had people sort of that you spoke to about writing. And as a journalist, I think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I often think that journalists who then become authors, whether they're writing fiction or non-fiction, they're used to an editing process, and I guess you were used to an editing process. So how was it? Did it feel at all different when people were giving you feedback on your fiction, or were you just like, oh, I'm used to being edited and being told to move something around or being asked to consider this, or was it very different because it was all coming from your imagination rather than from kind of research that you had done?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because I think sometimes people really struggle with the feedback aspect of the workshop. And I didn't, to a great extent. And I think in part that's because I'm used to sort of people saying, hey, this is like nonsense, go and do it all over again. But it did feel different because it's quite personal, right? Like it almost feels like, I know it's not personal what you've written. It's can't be considered. It's not a reflection of myself as a person, but it feels like that often. And I have to, even today, tell myself, if somebody reacts sort of negatively to what you've written, they're not reacting to you as a person or your character, but it does feel like that. So there is an aspect of it which is quite different. And I do still say that, in journalism, it's so much of it is teamwork, and, you're really part of that newsroom. And it's to get, especially the newspaper, to get it out, like it's a really collaborative effort. But with writing, ultimately it's just yourself and, all your insecurities and the page. And no matter what anyone says, you have to really sort of silence the voices in your head to get your writing done. So it feels quite solitary, and not at all like what it was when I was a journalist. And some of that is also there in the response that I receive as a journalist. I could just see that, I need to do this to make the report better. But when someone says something about what they've written, which is sort of fiction, then it can feel personal. And then, there's like sort of 2 weeks of moping around and thinking like that person doesn't know anything. They're completely wrong before you come around to seeing their point of view. So at the workshops at UEA where I did the MA, the idea is you don't really speak when your work is discussed. And I prefer that because I think my media response would be to say you're wrong. So.
But it is interesting because writing a book, particularly writing a novel, like you say, it's a very solitary experience for a long time. It's you and your computer or your notebook and your notes and your scribbles. But then when you get a book deal, it then sort of becomes more of a collaborative effort in the way that I guess a newsroom was. And that's I guess a different kind of feedback to what you were getting in the creative writing books, because it's much more about your whole novel and kind of everything about it. How did you find that sort of process of working with your agent and with your editor on the whole manuscript for Gin Patrol and the Purple
Line? I think when you're doing, when you're in a workshop or you're swapping work with your friends, there's still that element of it not being for publication. So it's still quite private. And that's how I felt. I didn't feel like, it's out in the world at that stage. So even though many people had seen my book before it even went to an agent, it still felt quite private. And I think there is that sense of losing control when, it goes beyond that. With I had, because I had sort of, I think 3 or 4 months, 6 months, I don't know, it's, I've sort of, it's just like blurred in my head, but almost 6 months, I would think. I think the book, around until May, from November to May, I was sort of editing based on the feedback from the editors, from the editor at Chatto and Random House in the US. So that was quite a long process. And it's sort of, again, it was for me figuring out what of everything that they've said, there is a knee-jerk response, which is to say, my book is perfect and don't touch it. And I know these people, like, these characters are mine and I know what's best for them. So it does take time to figure out what you should listen to and how you can weave that in, because, once a story is written and it's edited, then to go back and change things, it's not really that easy. So I think I just went sort of crazy for 2 months. There's no other way of saying it. I didn't meet anybody. I just ducked everything, and it was just sort of just sitting with my laptop and, reams and reams of paper and trying to figure out how to do it. So yeah, I was barely human at the end of that process. But, at all points, I was very aware that it is a privilege to have people who are interested in your work as you are, because otherwise it's just you and, you're writing and it's important to you, but not to others. So it is always a privilege to have editors or agents who are interested in it and who want to sort of make it better. And I was very conscious of that as well. So yeah, I think you're sort of worried about disappointing everyone. And then, it's, it was quite difficult to edit it and get it to the point where the editors felt it was fine as well. With me, I think, I don't think I can't bear to look at the book again, because I can see 100 things that I would rather change. And for me, that's my process.
I guess one thing you always have to remember is that, I realise that when you're in the midst of it, this can be quite hard to kind of keep at the front of your mind, is that people do love your book and they saw something in it, and that is why they said, let's publish this book. And I kind of want to just go, I guess, sort of slightly earlier in the process. So we heard at the beginning when I was introducing you that you entered sort of drafts or like partials of the novel for prizes. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, about how you knew it was kind of ready to put forward, or whether you were like, oh, maybe it's not ready, but I'll do it anyway and I'll kind of take that leap? Like, how do you know when your book is ready to be seen by somebody else, even if that's not going to then be seen by the rest of the world for like a year to come or something?
So with these competitions, they were for novels in progress, so you didn't have to have the completed novel. And if it was that, I don't think I would have entered it, because the novel was in no shape to be entered in, at that form. It was sort of the first 30,000 words. And I had to sort of finalize that for my dissertation at UEA, because I was doing an MA there. And this was a book that I'd written as part of my MA, and it was my dissertation. So I did have it sort of, the initial chapters were workshopped, and I had feedback from my dissertation supervisor. So I think I felt slightly more confident about those parts. And so the good thing about these competitions is that they have sort of very firm deadlines, which is quite useful when you're writing without, by yourself, and there's no reason to complete anything. So I sort of use these deadlines to motivate myself to complete a certain number of words. So I think the longest that anybody required was 30,000 words. And it was quite good to have, that deadline to finish sort of 30,000 words and enter it. I wasn't expecting anything, but before that I had written, sort of 2 novels. I'd written many short stories, enough to put together as a collection. So essentially I'd written 3 books, and this is my 4th book. And I really wanted to know if I should, spend that kind of time again on a book, whether this was going to go anywhere or it would end up in the bottom drawer like the others. So part of the reason why I submitted was I thought, I'll get feedback from, people who don't know me at all. All these competitions were anonymous. And for me, that was definitely a big draw, that it was just, they were deciding based on the writing on the page and, the story and the characters. So that was, I don't think you get that anywhere else. You'll never have that in your life again, to be judged solely on the basis of your writing. So that was one of the prime reasons why I entered. And, it was, when it was longlisted for me, that was definitely, it did motivate me to sort of keep working at it and to complete it, because I felt like it might find an audience. So yeah, I would, if my friends, I always encourage them to sort of enter these competitions, because I think otherwise you can sort of sit and just work and rework it again and again. But it's good to sort of get that sort of external feedback from someone who doesn't know you, and it's good to see what they think.
I mean, it obviously worked for you, and like I said, Gin Patrol was published earlier this year. It was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction as well, and so I'm intrigued if those works that you mentioned earlier, those few novels that you have in the bottom drawer, if any of those will be kind of ones that you go back to and kind of work on again, or if they are very much like, no, I'm done with those. And if that is the case, what did you learn from writing those novels, even if they will sort of never be read by the general public?
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever take them out ever again.
Okay.
I think one thing it taught me was that I could actually complete something, because writing a novel, it takes time, at least for me. It's 2 or 3 years, and you need to have that stamina, and you change as a person as you're writing it, and you're not the same person as you were when you're beginning the novel. And so it was, for me, just the only thing, I think one of the main things I realized was that, yeah, I can complete it, and I have it to just sit down and work. I can do that. I don't know if I learned more about writing. My writing is really awful.
I'm sure that's not the case.
I'm hesitant to claim that much, but yeah, that's. I mean, I realized how much I wanted to write. I think because the first time I wrote the novel, it was just not like, I finished it, I edited it, and then I realized, okay, this is not good enough. Then I was quite depressed, and I thought, I'm not going to write another book because this has taken 3 years, and I don't want to spend that kind of time again. but actually after sort of a year, I started writing something else. And so I think it's good to know that, you know, that impulse is there, irrespective of what the world thinks of your writing or whether anyone wants to read what you've written or not. It's just sort of, you know, I'm motivated by myself. And I think that's good to know.
Yeah. I know that you are working on something else at the moment, but I know that also you don't love to talk about it. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of your writing process. Are you one of those people that sort of wakes up at the same time every day, sits down at 9 a.m., writes 3,000 words, and then is done? Or are you kind of more scattergun in your approach? How do you work?
That sounds like the person I want to be.
Okay. Yeah.
Aim to be. Like, that's my New Year resolution. It never happens. No, I can't. I just think, you know, I've got other responsibilities, and like, you know, I've got other things to take care of, and it's really a function of privilege if you're able to sort of sit down every day at the same time and spend that kind of 3 or 4 hours. I think not everybody has that, and it's just you know, whenever people say you have to write every day, I just get very annoyed, because I just think it's not feasible, it's not possible for many people, and it just means that a lot of people who have to sort of work very hard, or, you know, got caregiving responsibilities, or they won't be able to write if you say, you know, you have to write every day or you're not a writer. So I don't believe in any of that. My approach is, I do try to write early in the morning, because, you know, half asleep is the time when the sort of self-critical voices in my head are the quietest. So it's the best time for me. And so like, you know, world around me is quiet as well. So like, ideal day of writing is sort of waking up at 5:30 and then getting sort of 2 or 3 hours, and doesn't happen often, I have to sort of admit that as well. But you know, what I try to do is to stay in the world of the novel, so, or, you know, short story or whatever it is that I'm writing. So if I just go and change sort of a sentence or go back over something that I've written, I can stay in the world and still be with the characters, and I think that's useful. If I sort of don't look at what I'm writing at all for 1 or 2 weeks, and I find it really difficult to, you know, get back to the story. But if I look at it every day, even if it's just to change sort of a comma or a, you know, a full stop, it sort of helps root me in that world. So that is essentially my process. It's very shameful, but that's what it is.
Whatever works for you, isn't it? That's the key. Like, I think no sort of boundaries on it. Just before we wrap up, you mentioned that you used to read a lot when you were younger, and I wondered what sort of books from your childhood has sort of stuck with you and inspired you. And I wondered if there was anything that you now go back to and sort of read whenever you need a reset, or when you needed to be reminded about what fiction can do or what words can do. Are there kind of any books that you hold up as kind of favorites for you as a reader, but then also as a writer?
So the books I started reading were in my mother tongue, which is Malayalam, and those were the first books that made me want to be a writer as well, because, you know, it showed me what you could achieve by just shifting sort of point of view, or like telling a story from, say, the voice of a woman who's not really, you know, heard in that kind of conservative society in which I grew up. So those were sort of my, you know, guiding lights, so to speak. But when I was a teenager, I started reading Michael Ondaatje, and I think his books are the books that I sort of return to the most. All his books, but particularly In the Skin of a Lion and The English Patient and The Cinnamon Peeler and Other Poems, which is a book of poetry. And I think whenever I feel that, you know, I don't have any more words and everything seems sort of dusty or rusted, I read his books again, because I think it's just remarkable what he achieves in terms of both his language, because he's a poet, and, you know, it's, the imagery is so wonderful and, you know, surprising, but also in terms of his characters and how they act. And he's also written about people we don't really see in history books, sort of the immigrants who built the cities. And those are the sort of stories that I'm interested in as well. So his books are the ones that I return to the most.
And just as a final question, and I guess it's quite a big question to end on, and I realise maybe it is one where I'm sort of asking you to reveal what you're working on, but I don't want to do too much of that. But is there a story you haven't told and kind of haven't approached that you one day want to, whether that's with your next book or whether it's 10 books down the line?
You know, there are lots of stories which I think I heard, I once read the Indian writer Neil Mukherjee say that, you know, if you're an Indian writer, you're never sort of, I'm paraphrasing him very badly, but essentially he said that you're never short of material if you're from India. And I think that's really true. You know, there's so many stories that I want to write. And yeah, I don't know if I'll live long enough to write all of this, but definitely there are so many aspects of Indian history, for instance, that's not really come out because, you know, history has been written so much of Indian history has been written by the British. And I'm definitely interested in looking at those stories from the Indian perspective, which I think there's not quite a lot of in fiction today. So yeah, there's some of those stories I would like to explore, and which is what I'm trying to do with my second novel. But we'll see how that goes.
Well, I look forward to that and to whatever stories you have to tell in the future as well. That is all we have time for, but thank you so much, Deepa, for your time, and thank you to everybody watching, and tune in for more of these events as well. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.